He knelt in the red earth at the gate of House 17B, with rain still clinging to his cap, a torn parcel at his feet, and 12 laughing strangers filming him as if he were a street play. If the wrong word left his mouth, the landlord's daughters threatened to post it before dawn, and his mother would lose the rent money they'd scraped together. Who would believe a delivery man over the glossy Instagram feed? And who would stand with him when the commenters piled on, calling him a thief? He tasted bitter harmattan on his tongue and felt the generator's distant hum like a watchman counting his faults. But there was a deeper, quieter power in the shadowed driveway, someone with more money than the whole of the street could imagine. Watching, or so he thought. And that hint of hidden power made his palms sweat. If the laughter could be stopped, how would he stop it? The gate slammed, a siren wailed in the distance, and Chuka saw, out of the corner of his eye, a man in a worn overcoat slip behind the bougainvillea hedge. Then the hedge threw up a secret that would not stay hidden. Chukwudi Chuka Naji's ordinary world smelled of wet earth and frying onions, a single-room house in Mushin that pressed up against the market like an old friend, where Danfo horns stitched the morning together, and his mother, Amaka, counted coins on a chipped enamel plate. He believed in work before applause, and in returning borrowed sugar to neighbors even when his pocket was empty. And his sister Ijoma, who shared their bed, told him every Sunday after church that his hands were for better things than being judged. "We feed on truth," Amaka would say, kneading yam with calloused fingers as the parish bells mixed with the muezzin's distant call. Chuka carried that saying into every delivery, into every corridor of the city where the rich ate by silver light and the poor by the spill of kerosene. Lamps. They laughed at the delivery man in the internet clip that dawn, and the sound of it followed him like a dripping roof, but he kept his head down because there was a family bed for him to warm and a promise he had made to Ijeoma, and he always knew where he belonged. The inciting blow came when a black envelope arrived at Greenleaf Couriers with a receipt for a family heirloom and the address of one of Lecky's newest compounds. Chuka was assigned to the job, and because the city runs on the shoulders of the willing, he pedaled his small tricycle through mud and traffic to drop it. "You're late," the security guard barked when he arrived, and a woman in a silk scarf shrieked when she opened the parcel to claim that a child's crucifix was missing. Voices rose like heat above the red dust, and a neighbor filmed while children laughed. And in the same breath the supervisor, Nkechi, said, "We'll suspend him pending inquiry," with a smile that meant pity only for herself. That word, suspend, felt like a guillotine, and as Chuka pushed his cycle away, the laughter braided itself into dread, because without work his mother's medicines could not be paid, and the roof over Ijeoma's head would be at risk. He did not yet know who had filmed him or why the hedge had shaken, but he did know the city was preparing to look at him and decide. The first trial was immediate and practical. Money evaporated faster than the harmattan mist as customers pulled their contracts and the dispatch sheet thinned to a few unpaid jobs. Chuka walked the market with bare feet through puddles that smelled of oil and plantain, and he counted every naira as if it were a soldier in his defense. "People will believe what's easiest to believe," said Tunde, a co-worker who would later smile too wide in the light of trouble, and he handed Chuka a cup of gari like a godsend while secretly keeping his eyes on the supervisor's lips. The cost was visible. Phone calls went unanswered. The landlord began to look at his door as if it might spit him out, and the video on social media gained another 1,000,000 eyes. So Chuka started asking questions, and the first answer made his knuckles go white. Why had the security guard spoken first? And why had the CCTV at House 17B been down when he arrived? At the heart of the next trial lived the wolf in sheep's clothing. Nkechi, who volunteered to help Chuka draft a statement at the office while smiling and buying him a donut, then forwarded that draft to the company's legal team with edits that pinned the blame squarely on him. "I'll get you a reference," she said in the corridor near the generator room, but the reference became a list of his latenesses and small mistakes translated into a pattern of character flaws. Tundi pretended surprise when the company froze his pay, and little by little colleagues who had once shared cigarettes with him began to swerve away. The betrayal stung because it looked like kindness. And as the postman's laughter echoed like a church bell, he thought of his mother laying out the last of their money. Would anyone stand up to a system that ate the poor for sport? They say cities have moods, and Lagos shifted against Chuka. The market bustle seemed to pulse with why. "Spurs?" Danfo horns honked as if eager for the next gossip, and even the churchyard that had once echoed with his mother's hymns felt smaller. A pattern interrupted his resolve when a lawyer's letter landed. Greenleaf couriers demanded arbitration and threatened to deduct the alleged loss from Chuka's last month's wages. So he ran to the courier's loading bay to demand answers, only to find the manager gone and Tunde with a patched story about a missing manifest. "We have to protect the business," Tunde told him, hands like a preacher. And Chuka watched a colleague who had shared lunch with him invent a narrative that would throw him under a bus for the company's balance sheet. The cost was a tangible, bitter thing, a notice from the landlord taped to their door, and the small hospital where Amaka received monthly tablets closed for repairs. When the dust settled, he had nothing but a thin plate of beans and a mounting question. Who could he trust? In the middle of those rising losses and the city's laughter, Chuka found himself at the edge of a church courtyard where rain had polished the red earth into glass. And there he saw an old man in a threadbare overcoat shaking as if the harmattan had settled deep into his bones. The man's hands were like old maps, his breath coming in short blue clouds, and there was no dignity to the way the other passers-by skirted him as if he might be contagious. Chuka's fingers, which knew parcels and names, did not hesitate. He took off his own cap, offered the man his umbrella and the single shawarma he had left for lunch, sat with him while the generator hummed like a patient animal in the distance, and listened as the man said, "Blessings will find the foolish," with a voice that had seen 1,000 storms. Unknown to Chuka, a small CCTV in the mosque courtyard, one of those county cameras people forgot about, caught the whole act, and a young woman with a phone watched the footage with a little smile before pocketing it. That kindness, warm on Chuka's hands and wet with rain, would later become the thread that pulled the whole neighborhood awake. Pressure tightened like a tourniquet after that kindness. The landlord set a deadline: pay or leave by midnight Thursday, and the Greenleaf legal team gave him 72 hours to settle the alleged loss or sign a document that would ruin his credit forever. 3 days, Amaka said, counting pills, and Chuka felt time like a drumbeat in his ribs as he tried to pull together favors, calls, anything to stop Ijioma's bedroom from being emptied and stacked in the corridor. Customers demanded refunds. The company's account department refused to release his bicycle until he signed away any claims, and strangers in the market began to spit when they said his name. The city's small mercies, an extra plate from a vendor, a priest's quiet nod, could not blunt the hammer falling toward his family, and he realized he had to produce evidence or watch his world crumble by dawn. The third day arrived like a drum roll, and with it came the midpoint twist that made everything before look like rehearsal. The old man in the threadbare overcoat was led into the Greenleaf courier's office under the glare of cameras and the hush of a now curious compound. He stood straighter when he removed his overcoat and pulled back a scarf to reveal a face that had been in the business pages for a decade. Damilola Ibekwe, founder of Ibekwe Holdings, the man whose factories and tech labs fed whole towns and whose oil palms shaded townspeople like gods. "You helped a man when his shoes were soaked," Ibekwe said in a voice that filled the room without effort. He had been living under a hidden identity to study the city when he collapsed near their church, and his lawyers had quietly watched the clip of Chuka giving him shelter. The revelation hit like thunder. The billionaire was not only real, he had the power to call the minister, the press, and the company's board at once, and every man who had laughed or scrolled and pointed had to choose whether to meet his eyes. This twist demanded Chuka choose, and the darkest moment after came when Tunde and Nkechi tried to keep the story on the old script by producing a doctored manifest that put the blame squarely on him, wanting the company to pay them off and silence the noise. Chuka could have accepted Ibekwe's first offer bounty to flee from public scrutiny and take a quiet life with his family safe, or he could use the moment for something larger. He tasted the sharpness of revenge and the gentleness of truth in the same breath, and remembered Amaka's hands folding yam as if prayer. He stood, heart hammering, and said, "No, I will not buy peace with another man's sorrow," choosing dignity over a shortcut that would have stained his name. His voice trembled but did not break, and that small courage made the room rearrange itself. The climax happened on screens and in flesh at once. Ibekwe released the mosque CCTV footage and the phone video the young woman had tucked away, and the truth unspooled. Chuka had been at the gate like any other delivery man. The parcel in question had been tampered with inside the mansion by a gardener who had sold its contents to a pawn shop, and the security guard had lied to cover the compound's negligence. Tunde and Nkechi's names were on emails revealing their plan to siphon small complaints into company bonuses. Their faces tightened as colleagues who once passed them bread now refused to meet their gaze. The city watched. Street barbers paused mid-cut. Market vendors put down their weighing scales. The Danfo at the intersection blew its horn once, and then was still. Justice arrived not as a storm, but as a sequence of clean, sharp notes, an apology recorded to the public, a restitution check in the company's name, and the headline that read simply, "They laughed at the delivery man." He showed others the price. Within days there was consequence and repair. Nkechi resigned under pressure, and Tunde faced an internal investigation that ended with dismissal and a public notice of misconduct that would follow him like a shadow in job applications. Ibekwe, who had tasted the city's bite as a poor boy and built wealth that allowed him to transform neighborhoods, founded a small fund to protect gig workers and quietly bought the building where Chuka's landlord had been planning to raise rents, preventing eviction for dozens of families. And then he offered Chuka something neither of them had expected: the resources to start a community-owned courier cooperative. "Use the money to give people chances," Ibekwe said as the compound security looked on, and Chuka watched his mother cry into her hands for the first time in years because there would be medicine and a roof again. The new normal unfolded like dawn across the city streets. Chuka's small cooperative employed former colleagues and vendors, gave Ijeoma an evening class scholarship, and replaced the jitter of hunger with generators humming over shared dinners on the repaired stoop. The Danfo horns still called the mornings, but now the deliveries were organized by a group that wore jackets stamped with a logo that meant stability, not scorn. The market chatter changed its pitch, and sometimes stopped to marvel at the man who had once been mocked for a torn parcel, and who now signed invoices and talked about fair wages. Chuka kept the humility of his delivery days. He still fixed a punctured tire himself and still ate beans with his mother on Sundays. But he also stood taller when boys in the alley asked him for advice, telling them, "Work with your hands, but keep your head free for the big plans," and the generator hummed like a steady heart behind them. The laughter stopped because the city learned a lesson written in ledger and in the small courtesies of a rain-soaked afternoon. Power must be met by kindness, and the sort of wealth that forgets its youth cannot build things that last. People who had pointed fingers now had to answer questions in front of the very neighbors they had belittled, and there was a visible, almost sacred exchange when Chuka and Ibekwe walked through the market together and everyone turned to bow their heads, not in shame, but in recognition of what had been saved. The secret was named aloud. The billionaire had been hidden, yes, but not to gloat. He had been watching to find a heart that would not be sold for comfort, and when that heart appeared, he used his wealth to heal a wound he had once been too proud to touch. Kindness plants seeds that the city wind cannot always see, but seasons come and they blossom. Truth moves slow, gathers witnesses, and then arrives with law and with conscience. Do not judge someone by the uniform they wear or the parcel they carry. There are fortunes in small acts, and there is dignity in choosing honesty over a quick escape. When you laugh at another's misstep, you do not know the ledger of their life. Sometimes the delivery man who is laughed at is carrying the single thing that will change a street's fate. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments about a time you stood up for someone or someone stood up for you. And if you want more modern folktales woven with red earth and city lights, please subscribe, like, share with a friend, and turn on notifications so the next story arrives when the generator hums and the Danfo horn calls us back to the street. Dawn found Chuka staring at the thin line of light across Market Street, as if the sun itself were a new contract waiting to be signed, and beside him, Ibekwe's quiet, watchful patience felt like a door opening into a room where every chair had a name. The interval beat had hit, and the city seemed to tilt toward mercy rather than accusation. The new dawn was not a speech, but a plan, a map drawn with chalk on the dust of the road. Register the Community Courier Cooperative, open a little bank account in the name of the people who had once been told to trust only the roar of a private fleet, and use the first grants not to build towers but to lay down a commons, a shared fleet of bicycles, a pool of tools, a ledger that everyone could read and trust. The morning market smelled of rain on zinc and fried plantain, of diesel fumes and sesame. And amid that chorus of sounds, Chuka heard Amaka's soft, steady voice in his memory saying, "We feed on truth." And he thought of Ijioma's quiet sleeping, breath, and the way their mother had learned to barter her pain into a little dish of hope. He turned to Ibekwe, who wore a simple suit jacket rather than the velvet of power, and carried a notebook full of numbers and people, and he saw the two of them as the first two lines of an old song, recited in a language that sounded like rain. This is how you hold a family together when the rain droughts the pantry. This is how you teach a street to share its bread. The interval plot did not arrive with fireworks. It came with a filing cabinet's sigh, the red tape of the city's bureaucrats, the quiet glare of landlords who had learned to count by the hour, and the stubborn hope of dozens of vendors who had learned to resist despair by showing up with a chair at a sidewalk meeting. The first big move was to register the cooperative as a nonprofit entity that could hire gig workers with fair wage scales, and no one would be left unpaid when the market laughed loudest. A lawyer who had once whispered insinuations into the ears of corporate boards walked into the new office with a stack of forms and a smile that looked almost like a flag, and his eyes rested on Chuka with something like respect, as if the man who carried the torn parcel of harassment had finally earned a hearing. "You're not just delivering parcels anymore," he said, glancing at Ibekwe. "You're delivering a system." The words landed like rain on parched earth, and the people listening clapped in small, surprised echoes that grew louder as the crowd learned the plan. A worker-owned cooperative with staggered shifts, transparent pay, and a community fund that would keep a grandmother's pills within reach and a cousin's small business afloat. The new structure required people, and so the first act of leadership fell to Chuka, with Ibekwe behind him like an unspoken guardian. The old kindness that had kept a stranger dry in the rain now repaid in the form of a ledger that showed where every naira went and who earned it. He spoke in a voice that was careful and plain, the rhythm of a delivery route and the cadence of a Sunday sermon rolled into one. "If we own the road we travel, we must share the fuel and fix the bike when it breaks," he told the room, and a few faces, vendors who had learned to count coins with the tremor of fear in their hands, nodded as if their fears were shrinking under the weight of hope. Beside him, Ibekwe allowed the room to breathe, letting the pause feel like a moment of forgiveness that could be measured in minutes rather than millions, a reminder that wealth, when kept honest, could be a shield rather than a weapon. A small boy in threadbare jeans tugged at Chuka's sleeve and asked, "So we won't be laughed at again?" And Chuka replied with a quiet, "Never again," which sounded to the boy like a promise, and to the grown-ups like the offer of a future they could finally trust. The interval beat's second act was the real test. Funds had to be found, governance had to be built, and a city that liked to think of itself as modern had to be re-educated in the art of listening. An anchor investor, visible only as a silhouette in a glassy tower across the highway, watched the early meetings with a careful, almost clinical distance, and the crowd felt the gap between the two worlds widen and then, with a small, stubborn breath, begin to narrow. Ibekwe's team announced a grant program funded by the profits of his many ventures, but the money would not simply land in a bag marked wealth. It would come with a charter that gave the community a voice in how it was spent, with quarterly town hall where the shopkeepers and the laborers would propose projects, and with a transparent audit that even a child could follow. The city's soft skepticism began to lift as numbers appeared on whiteboards. Percentages of wages saved, hours opened for training, days reserved for shared meals. And the whispered fear that the rich could always outpace the poor seemed to thaw under a sun that they all could feel warming their shoulders. Yet the urban bedrock did not forget the old tensions, and a wind rose through the market like an argument in motion. The landlord's eyes in the doorframe, the old guard with a pocketful of favors, and a clerk who remembered a face from the clip that had once branded Chuka as a thief. The tension sharpened when a rumor spread that the cooperative's first act would be to settle the rent for dozens of struggling families. A rumor that, if true, would redraw the earth beneath many feet and threaten old gods of scarcity who fed on fear. The turning point arrived as a quiet thunderclap. A memo leaked from the city's records office, not a declaration of corruption, but a confession in the form of a page, a single signed note from a former security chief who had once served at House 17B and then left the city in a hurry when a different set of hands started counting the coins. The note admitted that the CCTV systems in several high-end compounds had a particular blind spot, an area where footage could be redirected and stories rewritten, and it named a person whose fingerprints had smeared the city's ledger for years. The same people who had tried to pin Chuka with the torn parcel, the same ones who had whispered that the poor should be kept quiet, the same ones who thought a hedge might hide a conspirator's smile. The revelation changed everything in that room. The crowd sat up straighter, the city official's pen stuttered across the page, and Ibekwe's face, which had always kept a calm, almost clinical poise, softened into something like a shared grief for the people who had learned to measure their worth by the size of their last receipt. "This is not about a man's pride," he said gently to the room. "This is about keeping the truth from becoming a weapon." Chuka heard that, and felt a surge of old, stubborn courage lift him, the same courage that had kept him from signing away his labor for the sake of a single month's rent. With the turning point came a decision that shifted the entire axis of their struggle. Rather than accept a tidy, quiet settlement that would leave the old guards intact and the neighborhood somewhat safer, the cooperative chose to publish the entire narrative, the footage, the memo, the plans for a truly community-driven fund, so that the city would see the cost of keeping power closed off from the people. The town hall filled with faces that had once watched and waited, as if the footage were a dance in a room they could not enter. Now they moved with a new rhythm, clapping when someone spoke of saving a grandmother's pills, nodding when a young mother asked for a safe route to school for her children. The fortress of fear began to crumble, not with a shout, but with a chorus of small triumphs. A landlord softened and agreed to a year-long rent freeze in exchange for a neighborhood rebuilding plan. The security guard who had once spread rumors found a new role as a courtyard caretaker, a guardian of the gate who kept watch and kept quiet about the wrongdoings he had once witnessed. And the gardener who had tampered with the parcel the person who had planted a seed of doubt in a man's life, appeared finally in a small side room during a late-night board meeting, confessing that he had acted out of desperation and had taken delivery of a small jewel from that same compartment as collateral for his family's debt. And that confession was not met with anger, but with a decision to help him heal, to teach him trades and give him a stake in the cooperative so his hands would stop stealing and start building. The climax, when it arrived, did so not as a single moment, but as a sequence of small, bright revelations. The public apology that flowed from the company's board, the restitution checks that began to reach families in need, the community's own charter that guaranteed fair treatment for gig workers and a transparent distribution of profits, and the moment when Chuka stood at the edge of the market with Ibekwe, a crowd behind them that included former skeptics and former skeptics of skeptics, and they watched as a blue-inked certificate was signed, not by a suit, but by a hand that knew hardship, and a man who refused the easy way out. The city answered the new dawn with a chorus of voices earned rather than borrowed, teachers who would tutor in the evenings through the cooperative's funds, a mechanic who would repair bicycles for free for those who could not pay, a grandmother who would finally receive the medicines that kept her alive without fear of eviction. The wealth gap did not vanish in a moment. No story so stubborn could be cured by a single handshake, but a new kind of fortune began to circulate, dignity, opportunity, and a shared stake in a future that belonged to all who had ever learned to fear the night market's laughter more than the day's hunger. For all the progress, one thread remained tight and unresolved, a needle waiting in the fabric for the next stitch. The gardener's confession had opened a door to a larger, older secret network that stretched toward the city's unseen corners, a web of influence that could still threaten the cooperative's fragile beginning if left unchecked. A note, slipped under a gate later that week, carried a single sentence typed on cheap paper. "You have a friend in power, and your plans are only as strong as your willingness to keep quiet about what you know." The handwriting looked familiar to Chuka, not because he recognized the author, but because the ink smelled of the same fear that had once scented the Harmattan air in House 17B. He folded the note and tucked it away, a reminder that even when the lullaby of justice seems to soothe the streets, the old song can rise again if a villain learns to sing it louder than the chorus of neighbors. The town's first year closed with a festival of shared meals and a small, everlasting glow from the cooperative's solar lanterns, a symbol that even in darkness a community could gather, tell stories of what was saved, and keep faith with the future by giving everyone a hand to hold. And as the festival ended and people drifted toward their homes, Chuka and Ibekwe stood at the gate and looked out over the market's mosaic of light and shadow, knowing that the interval had ended only to begin another chapter, that the true test would be keeping the light on when the wind shifted, when the old enemies breathed again, and when the ledger's balance would be weighed not by profit, but by how many lives it could lift.